So, yeah, I just want to give you guys a real quick run through as far as our overall course structure for these 3 weeks. Last week, we looked at the tabernacle itself, looking at its construction when it was received by Moses at Sinai and how it was built and all of the particular directions that God gave in that process and understanding its original significance. This week, we're going to be looking at the priesthood and the sacrifices that were made in the tabernacle, the ones that God prescribed in Leviticus. So we're going to be spending some of our time in Leviticus. Not that we'll be going verse by verse. No. I'm going to give you a summary. So we're going to look at the priesthood, the sacrifices, and then, of course, we have to talk just a little bit about atonement this evening. Next week, and I'm sure some of you have been wondering when I'm going to discuss some of the ways that the tabernacle's construction is used in the New Testament, some of the ways that it foreshadows things in the New Testament. That is next week as we talk about the tabernacle's typology and how the New Testament uses the tabernacle in teaching us about God's progressive revelation of himself and his plans. So that's next week. That's upcoming. Hope you guys can join us for that. Now, this week, I thought we might first do a teeny bit of review. I'm not going to go through a lot, but I just wanted to remind you a little bit of what we talked about last week. Okay, so you can see that reconstruction of the tabernacle there. This is a picture that was taken of a reconstruction that's in the desert in Timnah Park in southern Israel, not far from the city at the very southernmost point, Eilat. And this one was set up sometime back in order to try to help Christians be able to walk through and see what this original construction would have been like in its original setting. So just really quickly, you can see again that we're talking about that space where God told them to build the tabernacle to very particular dimensions. In the courtyard, you can see there in the picture the brazen altar where all the sacrifices were burned, or the various portions were. You see the bronze laver or basin there where priests would have washed before their service. And then moving into the tabernacle there, you would have seen the holy place where the lampstand was, where the showbread was, where the altar of incense was, and then the veil, and behind that, the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, inside that small 15-foot space there at the 15-foot square space at the back of the tabernacle, okay? So we went through all of those details last week. I thought this week we might start with a couple of words of scripture. Okay, let me read these for you. The first is from Leviticus 17, verse 11. It says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. For it is the blood that makes atonement by the life." All right. This is from Leviticus 17. God is drawing that direct correlation between the idea of our life, the blood pumping in our veins that gives us life, tying it to this idea of what is it that makes atonement for our lives, those of us who have sinned, which if that's not you, then the Bible says you're a liar. So tying that idea that atonement is made by blood, it's made by life, all right? So, and then the next verse that I wanted to highlight is from Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22. It says, "Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins." So what we're going to be talking about tonight is atonement in general. We're going to be talking about sacrifice, the life blood of the sacrifice poured out on behalf of the worshiper in the tabernacle's ministry by the priests as well as by the worshipers. We're going to be examining some of these ideas in more detail here tonight. So I want to begin with talking just a couple of overview ideas about sacrifice. Sacrifice, of course, is not unique to the Torah or to the Tanakh. It's not unique to the Bible. There are many other cultures and religions over many millennia that have done sacrifices. They've all been for various reasons and by various means, but the Bible gives a very particular version of what sacrifice should be and should look like. However, God doesn't codify these things until the Mosaic covenant. Now, we have some indications that God must have given some idea, God must have given some indication of what he liked and what he didn't like because of some of the sacrifices that we saw prior to the Mosaic covenant in the Torah, in Genesis. Now, on the very left of your screen there, you see a picture of Adam and Eve on their way out of the garden, right? Adam and Eve on their way out of the garden after they had sinned, God, and they realized that they were naked. God is the one who made clothing for them out of animal skins. Of course, there are some who debate, but I believe that God must have sacrificed the life of an animal for the sin of Adam and Eve in that moment, and made skins and clothing out of those skins for them. Now, this picture, just so you know, I think God is probably a better tailor than that. They look a little bit like rags to me, so maybe that artist has something else in mind. But we see the idea of sacrifice beginning all the way back there in Genesis chapter 3. And then you notice there in the center picture, we see the sacrifices of Cain and Abel. And of course, Abel's sacrifice was acceptable to God, but Cain's was not. And so we have a picture of sacrifice there that was acceptable to God, the kind that he wanted versus the kind that he didn't want, that he didn't think was appropriate. On the right-hand side of your screen, you see Noah after the flood. One of the very first things that he did was to sacrifice to God. In fact, all of the patriarchs, from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, even going back further to Job, we see God telling Job to make sacrifices on behalf of his friends, I guess you could call them that, because they didn't say what was right about God. God was instituting this idea his way in his time, and as the progression of God's revelation was rolled out for humanity, it wasn't until the Mosaic covenant where God actually told them all the details of what sacrifices were acceptable, what weren't, and what actually managed to make atonement for his people. All right. So I'm not going to walk you through every single instance, but those are just some of the major ones of seeing sacrifices prior to the Mosaic covenant. Let me give you just a real brief overview of some of the elements of the Mosaic sacrifices before we move to priests, and then we'll get into Leviticus from there. Okay, so you see there some of my fun pictures of what animals were used. Of all the different sacrifices that were made, there were only 5 different types of animals that were ever used as a sacrifice. Okay, an ox or a bull, a sheep. Both of these can be male or female under certain requirements, under different sacrifices or rituals. So you see an ox or a bull or a cow. You see a sheep or a lamb, male or female, goats, male or female, turtle doves, and pigeons. Now, don't those animals look cute? Don't they just look adorable? That sheep with his tongue sticking out. You don't want to hurt the cute little woolly sheep right there, do you? And yet, well, now actually, if you look at the pigeons, one of them kind of looks like he's giving me the evil eye. He looks like he might actually have what's coming to him. But on the whole, these animals were supposed to be blameless. They were supposed to be pure. They were supposed to be unblemished. They were supposed to be wholesome and good, right? The best that you have. You give the best that you have to God. All these animals were supposed to be without any blemish when they're offered to God. The 5 different types of sacrifice listed in Leviticus chapters 1 through, well, roughly 7. But the 5 different types of sacrifices are the burnt offering. The burnt offering was a whole animal burned on the altar. Okay. Then there's the meal or the grain offering. This was usually an expression of thanksgiving to God, recognizing his sovereign provision in your lives. There's the peace offering, which is an expression of experiencing peace or fellowship with God. Something good happens in your life and you want to just say, God, it is good to be yours. You offer a peace offering. Then, of course, there's the sin offering. And then there's the trespass or guilt offering. And we'll get into some of the differences between those as we get into the details about those different sacrifices. All right. So before we get into all those details in Leviticus, I want to talk just a little bit about the priests, the ones that stand between you and God, the ones that are mediating this position of the worshiper. Okay, so let's talk about priests for just a little bit. Throughout Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, we learn quite a bit about the priests themselves. The text tells us that only Levites were allowed to serve as priests. Only Levites, that's of the tribe of Levi. Now, in Numbers and in Exodus in particular, they're often referred to as the sons of Aaron. And God says in Numbers chapter 8 that God set the Levites apart to be his because he considered them to be Israel's firstborn, which is kind of funny if you stop and think about it for a minute, because Levi wasn't actually Jacob's firstborn, was he? No. He had Reuben, he had Simeon, he had Levi, and then Judah. So Levi wasn't actually the firstborn, but God goes out of his way to say, I am considering Levi to be the firstborn. I want them. And the reason why God gives is because he says that the tribe of Levi, the sons of Aaron, were the ones that were wholeheartedly dedicated to me. Now, in the case of Reuben, in Jacob's blessing at the end of Genesis, he points to Reuben's shameful behavior in taking one of his concubines as his wife. Reuben is no longer the firstborn. And then we have Simeon and Levi, and that interesting story about Dinah and the situation that happened there. And so Simeon isn't considered firstborn. And in terms of ruling Israel, that disqualified Levi in that situation too, because Jacob's blessing skips right over him and says that the rulership of Israel, is going to live with Judah. But God says, no, wait, not so fast. That may be true in terms of ruling Israel. However, I'm going to consider Levi as my firstborn, the first one that I'm going to take as my very own. Everything that's firstborn belongs to me. And so I'm claiming Levi as my own. So the Levites were, of course, required to maintain a level of physical and spiritual cleanliness above everybody else. Leviticus 21 is quite the read if you ever have time to go back. I mean, they can't even grieve with their family when one of their spouses dies if they're the high priest, but all Levites had very particular rules about what they were allowed to do, what they weren't, what would make them impure in front of God and not able to serve the way that they were supposed to serve. So they had to maintain physical and spiritual cleanliness. And then you might wonder, how in the world are the Levites supposed to live? I mean, when God gave all of them their portions of the land when they made it into Canaan, God specifically said, and even all the way back to Jacob's original blessing, he said, you're going to be scattered throughout the tribes of Israel. You're not going to have your own inheritance. I am your inheritance. And you can kind of see one of the small Levites at the back of the crowd going, okay, God, that's really nice, but how do I eat? Where do I farm? How do I take care of my family? And what we find out is that God makes provision for them in the sacrificial system. God provides various portions of different sacrifices that are specifically supposed to be given to the Levitical priests, special tithes that were taken up for them. And even though they didn't have a normal inheritance in Canaan when they got there, they were given 48 different cities that were specifically given to Levite families in Joshua chapter 29. So the Levites were supported by the funds and by the sacrifices that were made by the worshipers that were coming to God. Now, while they are ministering in the tabernacle, God had some requirements for them there as well. Remember, when the worshipers were coming to sacrifice, I mean, God made a very, very big deal about how it was to be done and the proper way that it was to be done. And we're talking about spiritual atonement here, right? So God had some very particular things, not just for the worshiper to have to consider, but also for the Levites who were serving in front of him. They were in the presence of God. He was very meticulous in what they were supposed to do and be, and even what they were supposed to wear. So when we talk about the Levites' garments, okay, there are a couple of things that they have in common. Now, just a normal serving priest on a random Tuesday afternoon, if you went up to the tabernacle and wanted to offer a sacrifice, the Levite that would show up there to serve as your priest for that particular sacrifice would, as far as what he would be wearing, he would have, the text doesn't give us all the details, but it says that they had coats and sashes and caps, or miters, you might call them. And the text says that they were supposed to be made for glory and for beauty, which is a cool way of describing it, isn't that? Now, we think that they were probably in some ways similar to the design of the high priest garments, but we don't get all the details. The text doesn't tell us, other than the fact that they're made of linen, that they're finely crafted, and that they have some similarities to the high priest's outfits. So let's look at the high priest outfits. But you know what? If we're going to talk about the high priest outlets, I say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I'm not even that creative. So I figured we need a high priest here tonight, and thankfully we even have one here among us, and I want to show you his picture. All right. Here is our high priest for the evening. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, the author of Israel Always and the radio, FOI radio host, our friend, Mr. Chris Katalka. I didn't make it. I swear, Chris.
Dan, you're going down, Dan. You're going down. I like it. That is great.
That is amazing.
Yeah, but it's got a certain panache. I could see you walking around the office like that, Chris. That might go over well.
That's what I wear to church, Dan. That's what I wear to church.
And I told him we have to have the high priestly beard. We needed to have it. It needed to exist in reality for an evening, and maybe on merchandise later. Okay, so let's walk through this, okay? What the text tells us in Exodus when God said to design the high priestly outfit for his ministry. The text tells us that there is a linen coat, and you can see the white linen undergarments there, and there's that base layer, so to speak, of what the priest would be wearing. You can also see the blue robe that's there. The robe was supposed to be made of all blue, which of course was very expensive to have that amount of dye and that color of dye. It was very expensive. It was supposed to be one woven piece, reinforced at the opening. It wasn't supposed to have any cuts or stitched together pieces. No, it's all one whole piece. It says at the bottom edge is supposed to be embroidered with pomegranates of blue, purple, and scarlet. Where have we heard those colors before? Yes, that's right. In the entrance screen of the tabernacle and some of the furnishing curtains that were in the tabernacle, those same colors show up again in the high priest's outfit because he needs to match his surroundings. God had a plan for making sure the high priest looked to be in place. Okay, and then of course it tells us alternating with the pomegranates on the bottom of his robe is supposed to be hung with golden bells that you can hear the priest as he's coming. Part of this has to do with maintaining his cleanliness. Part of it is so that we can hear the priest as he is going about his business, making intercession for us. This is to let us know that good things are happening, right? Now, above that is what is called the ephod. Okay, the ephod, it's kind of a two-sided smock or apron almost. It was made of blue, purple, and scarlet yarns, fine twined linen together, and also gold wire was woven into this embroidery in kind of a checked pattern. Now, I'm not so sure that tic-tac-toe pattern that we have on our screen there is exactly right. Remember, these were supposed to be the work of an artist, so we don't know exactly what that pattern may have looked like, but maybe something like that. The ephod hung over his shoulders, front and back, and then it's bound to him tightly around the waist with the sash, or possibly your Bible might say a girdle. It's made of the same type of embroidery as the ephod, wrapped around him, and then excess is hung down the side. You notice up on his shoulders are some beautiful stones, right? These are, in the text, they're referred to as onyx stones on the shoulders. Now, we're not sure exactly what stone that may have been. The Septuagint translated that essentially emeralds, so it may have been emeralds. Josephus claims sardonyx, which I don't even know what that kind of stone is, but there are precious stones on his shoulders. And binding together this whole outfit that we see hanging down from his shoulders is the breastplate. All right, it's made of the same embroidered material as the ephod, except this one also has gold settings, gold filigree, gold rings that hold it together, and the gold chain that connects it up to the onyx stone shoulders, right? It's square and it's doubled over, so it has some pouches inside where things can be set, which we'll talk about in just a minute. It's also inset with 12 stones, each representing different tribes of Israel. Each stone has a name of the tribe engraved on it. Now, what do we put in the pockets? One of the great mysteries of the Bible. We put into the doubled over portion in the back of the breastplate, the Urim and Thummim. All right. Now, anybody that tells you that they know exactly what those are is probably lying to you, because the text doesn't tell us what they are. The word itself actually means lights and perfections. Okay. And the way that they're used in the text is that they are used for helping to determine God's will or God's counsel. They're placed in those pockets. The text says that they're supposed to be right up against the high priest's heart. So determining God's will, or a means of determining God's will, consulting with God, is held right up against his very heart, right? These, as I said, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of details about what they actually were. There's only 7 times in the text that Urim or Urim are used, And there's only 5 different times that the Thummim are used. They existed clearly into Saul's reign because there's a reference of Saul consulting God through them. And some even claim that it might have existed into the post-exilic era, but again, we don't know that for sure. So the Urim and Thummim are there in the breastplate. We need no reference to Chris's iconic glasses that you can see there. Those are not part of the high priestly garb, just our high priestly garb. But on his head, you'll notice that there is some of your texts might refer to it as a mitre. Some refer to it as a turban. It's linen. It's kind of like a crown. Josephus says that it was supposed to be like the crown on his head, right? It's also got a pure golden plate attached to the forehead with a blue cord, and the plate had engraved on it, "Holy to the Lord." Okay, this is like the most profound tattoo of all time. Belonging to God and God alone is the idea. Now, the only time that he would serve while wearing something other than this would be on the day of Yom Kippur, when he would serve and offer that sacrifice on that day wearing simply just a plain linen robe that was made new each year for that occasion. Now, we don't see his feet here, but throughout maybe the past 1,000 years or so, you may have heard reference to the idea that some people think that when he served on the day of Yom Kippur, that he would have a rope tied around his ankle, because when he went in there, if he did something wrong, God would strike him dead, and then we have to haul the guy out and drag him out of the temple because nobody else, or in the tabernacle, because nobody else is able to go in there to see, to be in God's presence like he is, right? So is there a rope? Well, apparently the answer is nope. There wasn't a rope because the idea of there being a rope actually is a tradition that comes from some rabbinic texts in the Middle Ages. The first reference that anybody seems to be able to find was in the Zohar, sometime in the 13th century. If you're familiar with that, good on you. I'm not going to take time to explain that to you. But no, as far as the Bible is concerned, as far as any of the early rabbinic material is concerned, as far as the Mishnah is concerned, the Talmud is concerned, there is no reference at all to the idea of him ever having a rope attached to his ankle. So you can take that out of your minds. All right, so we have our basic idea of what animals we use. We have our basic idea of what the priest looks like when we come up to the entrance of the tabernacle as we are about to make sacrifices. So let's turn our attention to the sacrifices themselves, the 5 different kinds of sacrifices. 2 thoughts before we get into the burnt offering. First, these sacrifices actually can be broken up into kind of subcategories of sacrifices. There are sacrifices that God refers to as his sweet aroma, sweet smelling aroma sacrifices that are essentially offered in terms of fellowship with God. And then there are the ones that are not considered sweet smelling aromas. These are the sacrifices for sin and for guilt. So you kind of have to separate the two. When we talk about burnt offering sacrifices, peace offerings, and meal offerings, we're not talking about sin sacrifices. It is the sin offering and the guilt offering that's dealing with sin. The others are for fellowship. So you deal with the sin first, and then you would offer sacrifices for fellowship. But that's not the way that the text lists them. It starts with the burnt offering, so that's where we'll start. But the second idea before we get into it there that I wanted to mention is that there are 5 different kinds of sacrifice, but there are not only 5 different reasons to sacrifice. There are different rituals for which you would use one of these types of sacrifices as God ordained for them. So the cleansing of priests or the day of Yom Kippur, or the sacrifice that's offered in a trial for adultery. All of these different types of rituals, the sacrifices that are offered as a part of them, use one of these 5 different kinds of sacrifices in order to fulfill God's description of what those rituals were for. So 5 kinds, used different ways, a couple of different times in the text. The burnt offering. All right. So the burnt offering in Leviticus 1 has it's an offering made by fire where the entire animal is burned on the altar. It's a burnt sacrifice coming from the Hebrew word olah, meaning to ascend upwards to God. You have a couple of options of which animal you might choose to offer to God as this kind of sacrifice, simply to worship God, right? So you might choose a bull, you might choose a male sheep or male goat, you might choose the option number 2 would be turtle doves or pigeons, one offered for sin, one burned if you're too poor. Okay, so essentially the delineation is if you got enough money, then you should probably be offering a bull. If you can't offer a bull, then you should probably offer a sheep or a goat, because that's kind of the middle class sacrifice, right? But if one of those is too expensive and you can't afford the Mercedes and you can't afford the Kia, then what do we offer at the bottom? Well, we offer the birds, right? We offer the turtles, we offer the pigeons, we offer the Fords. I'm not sure. Maybe you like Ford. I don't know. So this animal must be without blemish. To show it to the priest. The priest decides whether it's appropriate for you and your station. The priest decides if it has any blemishes or not. He says, okay, we're going to go ahead with this, right? Now, what happens at this point is the worshiper brings his animal right to the front door of the tabernacle. Now, there's one stipulation here, okay? If you're offering a sheep or a goat, the text says that the offering is supposed to happen at the north side of the altar. Okay, the north side of the altar, which on our picture right here, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the north side of the altar is here. Remember, the entrance always faces east, the back always faces west, the north is on this side. So in order to make your sacrifice, if it's a bull, it's outside the courtyard. If it's a sheep or a goat, it's inside on the north side of the altar, which means that you would have to go in with the priest to the north side of the altar if you're a worshiper, if you're there to make a sacrifice. Now, odds are not anybody could go in, and odds are that it was probably just the head of the family, the patriarch of the family, that would be offering it on his and his family's behalf. But that's the only opportunity that I know of where we see people potentially going into the courtyard themselves, where the priests were ministering. So the worshiper brings his animal. He lays his hands on the head of the animal, symbolically recognizing the substitution of one life for another. I belong to God. This belongs to God. I am laying my sin, my guilt, my everything on this. And some very ancient sources say you're supposed to press in with all your might, as if you're leaning all your weight on it, like this is the only thing that's holding you up. Interesting, right? So you lay your hands on the animal, and then they kill it. They use a knife, they slit the animal's throat. Guess who slits the throat? Not the priest. No, it's the worshiper who does that. Blood splatters everywhere, right? The priest's job is to come in with one of those bowls and catch some of the blood as it's spurting out from the animal. And then the priest takes that blood in that bowl, takes it to the altar where those sacrifices will be burned. He splashes the blood against the sides of the altar. Meanwhile, the worshiper, and probably with some help from the priests, the worshiper flays and butchers the animal, takes the skin off, The priest gets to keep the skin. And then he cuts up the pieces of the animal into the parts that it's supposed to be made. They cut it up into pieces that will eventually go on the fire. The priest places the pieces on the fire, head and the fat, and then the entrails that he washes out, and then the legs with after that. They arrange it all on the altar as it begins to burn. If the animal is doves or pigeons, because someone poor is making this sacrifice, then the priest is supposed to bring those birds to the altar instead of the worshiper. This is the priest's job. If it's in the case of birds, he's supposed to wring off its head. He's supposed to drain its blood on the sides of the altar, splattering it on the sides of the altar. And then he's supposed to remove the crop and all the feathers, and he throws that on with the ashes on the east side of the altar. And then he's supposed to tear open the bird by its wings and then throw it onto the burning sacrifice. The burnt offering was supposed to be offered once a day, at the least. Sacrifice daily, God said. There should be something offering this relationship between you and me, this sweet-smelling aroma, this idea of our relationship being based on life for life, offered to God. The second type of sacrifice is the grain or the meal offering, your text might say. And I'm looking at the time, and I promise I'm going to speed up here, okay? The grain offering. The grain offering was given by the worshiper to God in thanksgiving. This is always a way of saying thank you, God, whether it's in terms of the crops that you've brought in, or whether it's in terms of something good that has happened. It must be made of fine ground flour. You use olive oil poured on and frankincense poured on. The priest will take a portion of it, burn that memorial portion on the altar, and then the rest of it goes to the priests. And the priests get to eat it, right? It's theirs, it belongs to them. You can offer that grain offering baked. You can offer it cooked in a pan or a griddle. You can even offer it uncooked as just roasted grains. And each one of those is offered with oil and frankincense as well. No offering could be made with leaven or with honey. When the grain offering is for first fruits or for peace offerings, it can have leaven, but then it can't be burned on the altar, which is an interesting stipulation. It can be offered as a sin offering in one case, which we'll get to, well, we probably won't touch on it, but in the case of the poor of the poor. But all grain offerings, interestingly enough, the text tells us, also need to be offered with salt. Okay, so that's a grain offering for Thanksgiving. The next is the peace offering. This is an offering given in thanksgiving for peace between you and God, but also between you and others. Okay, so this is the shalom offering. It's not only about thanksgiving to God, but it's also about peace with God and with your brothers. Its offering can be a cow, a lamb, or a goat without blemish. You must also bring bread, unleavened bread, wafers, loaves, mixed with oil. One loaf is offered to God, and the priest gets to keep it, but the rest of it, after the worshiper lays his hands on the head of the animal, symbolically recognizing, the substitution of a life given to God. If it's a cow, it's killed at the entrance. If it's otherwise, it's killed before the Lord, which possibly was right there on the north side of the altar. The priest throws the blood on the sides, as we did in the other. The priest and the worshiper butchers it and burns God's portion, which is just the fat, the kidneys, and the liver. And then the breast of the sacrifice is waved before the Lord by the priest. Okay, and then this is the interesting part. After the breast and the thigh are removed and given to the priest, all the remaining meat of that sacrifice, remember that portion's been burned, a portion's been given to the priest, and then there's a whole bunch of animal left. What are you supposed to do with this? The text tells us that all the remaining meat must be eaten on the day of the offering by anyone who is clean. So in other words, it's a party. It's a potluck. I go and make my offering to say, God, I'm at peace with you. I'm at peace with men. And I invite those men into a meal with me. Anyone who's clean, we're going to eat this entire animal today. You're probably going to need some friends, right? You need some people around you to join you in your celebration of shalom, which is just a really cool idea. And then we get to the sin offering. Yes, I chose the cute and cuddly lamb for this one on purpose. Aw, cute little lamb. Well, if we're offering a sin offering, then this is an offering that is committed for sins unintentionally. There are, again, that breakdown in terms of who is making the offering as far as what animal you're allowed to use. Okay, so a priest who sins unintentionally, needs to bring a bull. If it's the whole congregation that sins, the elders are supposed to offer a bull. If it's a sin committed by a leader, like a ruler or a king, eventually, if it's offered by a leader, the sin offering is supposed to be a male goat. And if it's offered by a commoner, just any one of us coming to offer a sin offering, I know I broke God's laws, I know I sinned, then it's supposed to be a female goat or a female lamb. And then the last, that's how it breaks down. The actual sacrifice itself is very similar to the burnt offering. Again, the worshiper lays his hands on the animal's head, transfers that idea of their sin and their guilt. The priest catches the blood as the animal is killed. He pours that blood, he splashes that blood on the altar, life for life. As he takes it into the courtyard, he sprinkles it 7 times inside the tabernacle, in front of the veil, inside, between the holy place and the Holy of Holies. He sprinkles it 7 times in front of the veil, and then he puts some of the blood on the horns of the altar of incense, and he puts the rest of the blood on the altar outside in the courtyard. The priests butcher the animal, burn God's portion, the kidneys, the fat, the liver, the skin, and everything else that's part of a sin offering is then taken outside the camp to what they say is a clean place. It's treated completely differently than all the other sacrifices. Now, for each one of these, the level of importance kind of goes down just a little bit. And so the portion where the priest would sprinkle blood inside the tabernacle doesn't take place for anyone else offering, other than if it's for a priest or if it's an offering for the whole congregation. Trying to skip ahead just a little bit here. Let's move on to the trespass or the guilt offering at this point. All right. Trespass or guilt offering. Now, this is, the text says, an offering given for a breach of faith unintentionally, or it can be done intentionally if it's done against your neighbor. Okay, so this is an offering that is distinguished from the sin offering. The sin offering is more about the sin itself, the condition of sin that I find myself having committed. The trespass or the guilt offering is more about making recompense. Okay, so it's more about the idea of trying to make justice done than just the idea of sin being covered for. Okay, so you have to bring a sin offering with your guilt offering. Whenever you offer a guilt offering, you got to offer them both for the actual sin and for the damages of the sin, both to you and to others, right? So compensation, the text says, to the Lord for any of these sins would be an offering of a ram, and its value has to be appraised. So the priest has to look it over and say, okay, I'll give you $200 for him, right? And then he has to decide 1/5 of that value also has to be given by the worshiper to the priest in money. Okay, so 1/5 of the value of that animal also has to be offered as a compensation, and it's given to the priests. They're offered the same way as the sin offerings, and as I mentioned, sin and guilt offerings frequently were offered together. Now, that idea of making restitution, it might bring to your mind a couple of occurrences in the text where we see people making recompense, so to speak, when they're confronted with their sin. One that might pop into your mind, as it has for me throughout the years, is the story of Zacchaeus, right? When he confessed to the Lord that he was changing his ways, and Jesus was in his house, and he said, Lord, if I have harmed anyone, if I've taken anything inappropriate, I am going to pay those people back. I'm going to give away half of everything I own. I'm going to give everybody back 4 times what it's worth. You might think to yourself, 4 times. Wow, that's a lot of compensation for, if I take $1, I'm going to give you 4 back. And maybe he's making a trespass offering as a part of this, so to speak. But interestingly enough, there's actually another sacrifice described in Exodus chapter 22. Whenever someone steals something from someone, if it's an ox, you pay them 5 times. If it's the equivalent of a sheep, you're supposed to pay them 4 times. So possibly what Zacchaeus is saying is, I've stolen. Or maybe in any case where I might have stolen, I'm going to pay back 4 times as much. So you see the Levitical sacrificial system at work there in the New Testament. All right, so you've brought your sacrifice to the entrance of the temple. You've made the sacrifice that you're going to make with the help of the priest. It's gone up in smoke there in God's presence before the Lord, and you walk away from this place. You walk away from the tabernacle good with God, right? You've managed to fix what was broken in the relationship. Your sin has been taken care of. Atonement has been made. That's the word that is used frequently all the way through all of these things. Make atonement, make atonement, make atonement. By this you will make atonement. Well, if you're anything like me, you're gonna ask the question a little bit, like, how does this actually work? What is it about this process that for God makes it so that judgment doesn't have to come, and that we now have fellowship, we now have communion? Well, I want to talk a little bit about atonement, the covering of sin. Frequently, maybe even most often, when you see the word atonement in your Bible, it's the Hebrew word kafar, right? Essentially, that word is used to describe a couple of different things, okay? It's a little bit different from English. It's not a one-for-one equivalency, but most often it means either to cover something, or when it's used as a noun, it is the cover of something. It's used to describe washing something, or in its range of meaning, it also means to appease the wrath of something. Okay, so the idea is there's this offensive, gnarly thing, and atonement is the idea that I'm going to cover it, or I'm going to wash it clean. I'm going to remove the offense that's around it. I'm going to make it so that when you look at it, you don't see that nasty, gnarly thing anymore. All you see is what's covering it, right? So the sacrificial system, according to Hebrews, the sacrificial system could never actually remove sin, especially eternally. It says the priests offer sacrifices daily, day after day after day, offering these sacrifices that can't ever take away sin. Well, if it can't take away sin, then why did God tell them to do it? Why did God expect them to make these sacrifices? Well, the sacrificial system may never have been able to take away sins, but it could atone for sins and for guilt. It could cover it. It could wash it. It could appease the wrath of God about it. Let me give you an illustration, okay? As horrifying as it might be to think about for some of you, every once in a while I kiss my wife. I mentioned to you last week that I have 4 kids. 3 of them are boys. They're very much boys in every way. And my oldest one in particular, he's 12 now, but for years, every time I would kiss my wife, my oldest son would go like this. Ow! Oh, I don't want to see that. Ah! He hated watching me kiss my wife. He did not want to see it. And so he would cover his eyes with his hands. And in a sense, you could say he was atoning. He was covering the offensive acts. He was cleaning up his vision of that offensive, horrible kissing. He was appeasing his own disgust by covering what he didn't want to see, right? That's the idea of atonement. It has this kind of broad range of what it means. We use the word atonement, but another English word that we sometimes use for portions of this description is expiation. That word emphasizes the idea of the removal of the guilt, the removal of the offense. And then sometimes we also use the word propitiation in English. That word emphasizes the idea of satisfying God's wrath. Okay. One more illustration about this. Okay. So if you steal candy from a store and you get caught by the store owner, I gotcha. How dare you take this from my store? If I jump in and I offer to pay for that candy bar that you just stole, and the owner says, all right, no harm, no foul, I'll take the money. I haven't lost anything. I'm not going to press charges. The guilt is, or the offense is now gone. The guilt is no longer there because payment has been made. That's the idea of expiation, okay? Now, if the owner just really wants to press charges because you stole that candy, and I say, all right, if you really want to press charges, don't press charges against my friend here from Equip class. No. Press charges against me. I'll be the one who goes and takes that punishment. I'll be the one who goes and satisfies that owner's sense of justice, that satisfies his anger over that injustice that has been done. That's the idea of propitiation, okay? Now, either one can be considered within the range of what we mean when we use the word atonement. It's all mixed in together. It's the idea of God has provided this method to the Hebrew people in the tabernacle where both the sin is dealt with, the offense is dealt with, the justice, the wrath that is deserved, the punishment that's deserved is appeased. All of it is washed, all of it is covered, all of it is satisfied. It's all taken care of. It doesn't take it away. It doesn't remove it. but it covers it, it washes it, it satisfies. So sacrifices made atonement by substituting that animal and his lifeblood in exchange for my lifeblood, making that animal the appeasement price, okay, the cost. And that's the idea of propitiation and also redemption, which we're not bringing that word into it so far, but it carries that idea as well. It's making the blood, the life of that animal, the expiation that brings peace and fellowship again. Interestingly, last week we mentioned how on the Ark of the Covenant, inside the Holy of Holies, the lid, the solid gold lid, almost 2 feet square of solid gold that the cherubim sit on, that God talks to us out of, through that space above the covering. Well, that word actually is kafar, right? Now, some of your Bibles might translate that just lid, cover, right? But if it's using that word kafar, it carries with it all this other meaning associated with it as well. Another way of translating that, probably a better way of translating that, is that what rested on top of that Ark of the Covenant was not just a lid, not just a cover, it was a propitiatory. It was an atoning thing, an atoning place. It was a place where expiation and propitiation happened. It was the place where God spoke to Moses. It was the place where God dwelt. Get this. I mean, this is cool to me. The place where wrath is placated is the same place where God is. The idea of God being wrathful against sin never overshadows the fact that God is also the source of what satisfies that wrath. It's the place where he is, where he reveals himself. It's the idea of the beginning of understanding grace. Granted, it's in a nascent form. It's not nearly as full as we understand it with the revelation of time, as God has gone through time to show us that we understand today in the New Testament, but it's the beginning of the idea of grace in the process of how God atones for sins. Not that God didn't have grace before, but the first time that we see it in terms of the sacrificial system. All right, so you got to ask the question. Now, there are some people who accuse people like me who are dispensational and premillennial. We have been accused in the past of claiming that in the Old Testament, people were saved or made eternally right with God through the sacrificial system. And now in the New Testament, in this dispensation of grace, that now they're saved through the atoning work of Jesus on the cross, as though there are two different ways that God atoned for sins, and that people were saved one way in the Old Testament and people were saved another way in the New Testament. We've been accused of this, but it's not true. We don't teach that. We don't believe that those sacrifices eternally made appeasement, made atonement for anybody. They only covered it, and it was only temporary. God said this has to be done again and again and again and again. This isn't what saves you. It's just what atones temporarily for your sin. So what saved them? For those that are going to be in heaven with us one day, what is it that saves them? Well, Hebrews makes it clear that the exact same thing that saves you and me is the same thing that saved them. We were justified, we were set right, declared righteous, not because we did all the right things, but by our faith. Faith in God, faith in God's plan, faith that he would make us acceptable, provide the means of our acceptability. And those sacrifices at the time were all that they knew, but they knew that God was the one who was going to make them right before him. Faith would be their means of acceptability, ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who was the fulfillment of all of what God was going to do in terms of how humanity would come back into a right standing with God. The atonement that Jesus made was eternal. These sacrifices were temporary, but they point in faith, not knowing the end of that story yet, for those Old Testament people, towards Jesus, which we now understand in the progress of Revelation. So, a couple of lessons from the Mosaic sacrificial system. And I would say that these are lessons that could have been understood quite clearly from by folks in the Old Testament, in the Tabernacle, as well as can be understood by us today. The first thing that I think becomes evidently clear as Leviticus minutely and very detailed way describes the sacrificial system and the blood involved and the cost of what it would take to atone for sin. The first idea is my life is forfeit because of sin. I mean, we don't often put it in those kind of terms, and we use New Testament terms. We say the wages of sin is death, right? But another way of saying that, kind of in line with the sacrificial system and the experience of faith in God through the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, another way of understanding that is the idea that my life is forfeit. It doesn't belong to me. I don't own it anymore because of sin. My life is gone. And it's because of the sin that I have committed. My life is owed in payment. The next idea that I think is important to gather from the sacrificial system is God's plan for atonement is incredibly gracious. Yeah, blood is necessary for atonement. Yeah, it's going to cost me one of my herd. It might cost me two of my herd or my flock. It's going to cost me a little bit, but it's not going to cost me my life. My life is forfeit, but to end up in right standing with God, it's not going to cost me that. No, God is going to provide another way. Not my blood, but a substitute's blood. The idea of substitutionary atonement and the grace of God to provide another way, not my life for my life, something else's life for my life, is an incredibly gracious idea to grab a hold of. We, of course, know that that's Jesus on our behalf, but it could also be seen in the sacrificial system. The third lesson that I think we can draw from the Mosaic sacrificial system is that fellowship and communion, acceptance with God, is the result of atonement. Now, stop and think about this, okay? If you live your whole life constantly trying to be clean, constantly trying to make the right sacrifices, constantly trying to remember the fact that that you're gonna sin again, you're gonna sin again, you're gonna sin again. It's difficult to understand that concept that fellowship and communion is the result of atonement. But did you notice that of the 5 different sacrifices that God describes in these passages, 3 of them come after the sin is already dealt with? After the sin is already dealt with, you can offer burnt offerings. You can offer thanks offerings, grain offerings. You can offer fellowship and peace, shalom offerings. There's more offerings that have to do with an ongoing acceptance from God once the sin is dealt with than there are sacrifices related to the sin itself. I think that's incredible. You see, I think something for us to consider is that once fellowship is achieved, once acceptance has been made, it's only, our acceptance with God is only based on that sacrifice, not on our current performance. They had to go back again and again and again. And then they could have fellowship with God. Then they broke it. Then they had fellowship with God. Then they broke it. Then they had fellowship with God. You and I don't have that same experience. Fellowship with God is the Christian existence. Because once that acceptance has been made, the sacrifices are done. The broken fellowship is over. You are justified in God's eyes. You belong to Him. Your relationship to Him is secure, unbreakable, not because you managed to keep doing good stuff, but because Jesus' sacrifice was that good on your behalf. We live our Christian lives so often as if we're still under the sacrificial system. You are eternally in communion with God. He has chosen you. He has made a way for you. He has redeemed you. He has propitiated for you. He has atoned for you. And now you are in perfect shalom with God. Is that your Christian existence? Now, the fourth lesson I draw out is how dramatically the sacrifices so clearly point to Jesus. And the New Testament obviously gives us more information, but in its context, even at the time, it dramatically reminds people that this atonement, as small and frequent as it has to happen, sacrifice by sacrifice by sacrifice, there has to be a final greater atonement coming. And it was Jesus, though they didn't know it. Some pointed towards the Messiah who would eventually bear the sin of the world and finally remove it entirely from the account of every worshiper. Even though they didn't know his name, they knew that a better sacrifice had to be coming. So what I would like to do, just to close, is to read some verses from Isaiah 53 with you. It says this about the final, perfect, atoning sacrifice for sin. Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We've turned everyone to his own way. And the Lord hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Thank God that he did. Amen. For you, for me, by faith for those in the Old Testament. Let's pray. Father, you are good beyond our understanding. With all of our study, with all of our hard work trying to understand, with all of our intellect weighed in on the issue, we only catch a glimpse of your goodness and your grace. Like Moses seeing the backside of your glory, all the good that we see in your revelation of your word, in the work of Jesus Christ, in your prophetic pictures of how you're going to bring all of this together at the end of human history. Through all of it, God, we know, because you are infinite, that we only have a taste. May you give us eyes to see. May you give us ears to hear. May you give us hearts that love all of your goodness for eternity. We love you. We thank you. We bless your name, Father. In the name of Jesus Christ, our final, perfect, atoning sacrifice, we come into your presence, Father. Amen.